The walls of the Bennett house felt heavier than ever, as if they carried the weight of every unspoken word, every memory that lingered too long. Since her mother's death, silence had seeped into every corner, and no one seemed to know how to fill the emptiness. It wasn't just absence, it was grief settling into the spaces between them, making itself at home. At 13, Olivia had learned to listen to this silence, even though it unnerved her. It whispered things that no one dared say aloud, things like nothing will ever be the same. Her father, Richard, moved through their home like a ghost, worn down by exhaustion that ran deeper than sleepless nights. He left early in the morning and returned late, too tired to engage in anything other than necessities. The lines on his face had deepened over the past few months, and Olivia knew it wasn't just from overwork, it was the quiet, gnawing guilt of not knowing how to hold everything together. Meanwhile, Lily, Olivia's 7-year-old sister, was too young to understand what was truly happening, but she sensed the cracks forming beneath their feet. She followed Olivia around the house, her tiny hands clutching the hem of her sister's shirt or her favorite stuffed rabbit. Lily's brown eyes, round and searching, often locked onto Olivia's with a silent question that the younger girl never dared ask aloud. Are we going to be okay? Liv. Lily's voice was small one evening as they sat side by side on Olivia's bed. Do you think Mommy can see us? Olivia paused, the lump in her throat growing tighter. I think she does, Olivia whispered, her voice just as fragile as the silence that enveloped them. And I think she wants us to be brave. Like you? Lily asked, looking up at her with admiration that only a younger sibling could give. Olivia forced a small smile, though she didn't feel brave at all. Yeah, like me. But the truth was, Olivia wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Painting was the only place Olivia could hide from the storm swirling inside her. Her room smelled of oil paints and turpentine, the floor scattered with brushes, half-finished sketches, and rags stained with streaks of every color imaginable. Here, Olivia didn't have to pretend. Here, the silence became something she could shape, something she could touch. When her hands held a brush, the weight of grief loosened, if only slightly, and poured out onto the canvas. She could paint things she couldn't say, things like sadness, hope, and longing, all blending together in strokes of color only she understood. Her proudest creation was a painting she'd finished a month ago. It was more than just a picture, it was a memory frozen in time, one of the last happy moments they'd shared as a family. Her mother, smiling warmly, held Lily on her lap, while Richard sat beside them with an arm wrapped around Olivia's shoulder. Olivia had captured every detail, her mother's soft curls, Lily's missing front tooth, even the slight tilt of her father's head that always meant he was trying to hold back a laugh. It was the kind of memory that Olivia was terrified of losing forever, especially now that their world felt like it was crumbling beneath them. This painting wasn't just art, it was everything she wanted to hold on to. But as much as she loved it, Olivia knew they were running out of time. The letters from the bank were piling up on the kitchen table, their threatening words clear even though Richard tried to shield her from them. Final notice and foreclosure pending were stamped in bold red ink on envelopes that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Olivia could see it in her father's eyes, the way he avoided looking at the bills for too long. No matter how many shifts he worked, the debt was too deep, and they were sinking fast. Something needed to be done. Olivia stared at the painting, her chest tightening. Selling it felt like ripping out a piece of her heart, but what other choice did she have? If there was even a chance it could save their house, save everything her mother had built, it would be worth the sacrifice. But she knew how Richard would react. He would never allow her to sell it, not after everything it symbolized. He clung to memories as tightly as Olivia did, and she knew he would see this decision as betrayal, not salvation. I have to do it, Olivia whispered to herself, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas as if it were something alive. It's the only way. That night, Olivia lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the house creaked around her. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the soft snores of Lily from the room across the hall, and the distant sound of her father shifting restlessly in his bed. The weight of the decision sat heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe. What if no one buys it? She thought. What if it's not enough? The questions circled her mind like vultures, but she pushed them aside. She had to believe it would work. She had to try. The next morning, while her father was still asleep, Olivia carefully wrapped the painting in brown paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the string around it, but she forced herself to stay calm. It wasn't just about the painting. It was about survival. Lily found her in the kitchen, standing by the front door with the canvas tucked under her arm. Where are you going, Liv? Lily asked, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Olivia knelt down and smiled gently at her sister, brushing a stray curl from her face. I just have to do something important. I'll be back soon, okay? Lily frowned, her small hands gripping Olivia's arm. Promise. I promise, Olivia whispered, hugging her sister tightly. And with that, Olivia slipped out the front door, the painting held close to her chest as if it could protect her from the uncertainty waiting outside. Olivia's heart pounded as she set up her small stand in the middle of the town square. The painting, her family's portrait, sat propped against a wooden easel, its vibrant colors both a beacon and a plea. She smoothed the brown paper beneath the easel, trying to ignore the knot twisting tighter in her stomach. This was it, her only chance. If no one bought it, there would be no second try. She watched as people shuffled by, caught up in their own lives. Some cast fleeting glances toward the stand, but most didn't slow down long enough to notice her. Others saw her, but with that brief, dismissive look reserved for things they deemed unimportant. Olivia kept standing, the weight of hope pressing on her chest, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop. Minutes dragged by. She clenched her hands to keep them from trembling, tracing the edges of her painting's frame with nervous fingers. The crowd was thinning, and despair began to creep in. Then a shadow stretched across her stand. Olivia looked up to see a tall man standing before her, his presence sharp and commanding. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, every line perfectly tailored. His slicked-back black hair glistened under the sunlight, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, cold and calculating, like twin blades of steel. "Selling this piece, kid?" the man asked, his voice flat and cutting, with just a hint of impatience. Olivia swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'm trying to help my family." She kept her voice steady, but her heart was racing. Something about the way the man looked at her painting made her uneasy. It was as though he saw it not as art, but as something to be acquired, a tool for his own purposes. The man crouched slightly to inspect the painting closer, the corners of his mouth barely lifting into what could hardly be called a smile. $50, he said without emotion. "Take it or leave it." Olivia's breath hitched. $50? It was an insult, not an offer. She had been hoping for at least $500, something that might actually help, but this wasn't even close. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she thought about refusing. But what if no one else made an offer? What if this was all she could get? Just as she opened her mouth to respond, the low hum of a car engine made her pause. She turned toward the sound, and her eyes widened. A sleek black car pulled smoothly to the curb, the windows tinted so dark that she couldn't see inside. The back door opened with a quiet click, and a man stepped out. He was strikingly different from the first man, his features softer, though no less refined. He wore a dark navy suit, understated but elegant, and a light gray scarf draped over his shoulders. His salt and pepper hair gave him an air of wisdom, and when he smiled, it was warm and genuine, like someone who hadn't forgotten how to care. "Is there a problem here?" the newcomer asked, glancing from Olivia to the man in the suit. "No, sir," Olivia said, holding the painting a little closer to her chest. "I'm just trying to sell my painting." The newcomer nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her words carefully. Then he turned toward the man in the charcoal suit. "Victor Barnes," he greeted with a polite but cool tone, acknowledging the other man's presence. Victor's expression soured. "Reynolds," he said, his voice edged with irritation. "I didn't know you dabbled in street art." "I dabble in talent," the man, Michael Reynolds, replied smoothly, his gaze never wavering. Then he turned his attention fully to Olivia. "May I see your painting?" he asked, his voice gentle and sincere. Olivia hesitated for only a moment before nodding and carefully passing the painting to him. There was something calming about the way he asked, as if he truly cared about the work she had poured her soul into. Michael studied the canvas in silence, his expression growing more serious with every passing second. Olivia shifted nervously on her feet, biting her lower lip. Would he see the value in it? Or would he dismiss it like so many others had? Finally, Michael broke the silence. "You have a rare gift," he said softly, his eyes never leaving the painting. "It's not just the technique, it's the emotion. You've captured something real here." Olivia's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and disbelief. No one had ever spoken about her art like that before. "How much are you asking?" Michael asked, turning his gaze toward her. I was hoping for $500, Olivia admitted, her voice small but steady. Michael gave her a warm smile, as if he admired her courage. "I'll give you 5,000. The words hung in the air, impossible and unreal. Olivia stared at him, stunned. 5,000. Victor's expression twisted with anger. "You can't just waltz in here and double my offer," he snapped. "That's not how this works." Michael remained calm, his expression unchanging. "The decision isn't yours, Barnes. It's hers." Victor clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. He looked ready to argue, but Michael's unwavering calm seemed to sap the fight from him. With a frustrated grunt, Victor turned back toward Olivia. "Well, what's it going to be, girl? $50 now, or a fantasy offer you'll never see?" Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced between the two men, one radiating cold pressure, the other offering a lifeline. Her instincts told her that this was a choice far bigger than just money. She took a deep breath and met Michael's eyes. "I accept," she whispered, her voice filled with both relief and disbelief. Michael smiled warmly, as though he'd known her answer all along. "Good choice." Victor scoffed, muttering under his breath, and stormed off without another word. Olivia watched him disappear into the crowd, her heart still racing from the encounter. When she turned back to Michael, she found him watching her with a look that was both kind and curious. "Your name is Olivia, right?" "Yes." "Olivia Bennett," she said, feeling oddly self-conscious under his gaze. "Well, Olivia," Michael said, still smiling, "I believe this is just the beginning of something wonderful." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an elegant leather wallet, and handed her a small stack of crisp $100 bills. 5,000, as promised. Olivia stared at the money in her hand, her fingers trembling. It didn't feel real. $5,000, more than she had ever dreamed of earning in one day. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the bills tightly. "You don't know how much this means to me." Michael gave her a reassuring nod. "I have a feeling I'll be seeing more of your work soon," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "How about I meet your father? I'd love to talk more about your future. Over dinner, perhaps." Olivia hesitated for a moment. She knew her father would have questions, maybe even doubts, but something in Michael's voice told her that this was an opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll ask him." Michael smiled once more. "I'll be waiting." As he walked back to his car, Olivia stood frozen in place, clutching the money and her painting, overwhelmed by the strange turn her day had taken. It felt like a door had opened, a door to a future she hadn't dared imagine. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew that this was just the beginning. Olivia burst through the front door, her breath uneven from the mix of excitement and nervous energy that had carried her home. She clutched the envelope with the $5,000, her heart still racing from everything that had happened in the square. Her father was at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped under the weight of another long day. He was sorting through bills, another grim ritual that seemed to mark the passing of time since her mother's death. "Dad." Olivia called out, her voice louder than she intended. She ran to the table, the envelope clutched in her hands. "You won't believe what happened." Richard looked up, his tired eyes narrowing with a flicker of concern. "What is it, Liv?" "I sold the painting," Olivia said, placing the envelope in front of him like a trophy. Richard froze, staring at the envelope for a moment before carefully opening it. His brows knitted together as he counted the crisp bills inside. $5,000. He blinked, as if expecting the number to change on a second glance. Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. Olivia sat down across from him, her excitement fading under the weight of his wary gaze. "There was this man, Michael Reynolds. He saw the painting and offered $5,000 for it." She paused, feeling the need to defend herself even before he spoke. "He said I have real talent, Dad. He wants to help us." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. $5,000, he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "For a painting from a 13-year-old? Olivia nodded quickly, sensing the disbelief thick in the air. "Liv," Richard said slowly, "people don't just hand out that kind of money for no reason. What does this guy really want?" "I don't know," Olivia admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "He said he believes in my work. He even invited us to dinner, to talk more about how he can help." She leaned forward, trying to catch her father's guarded expression. "Please, Dad. I think this could be good for us." Richard sighed deeply, running a hand over his stubbled chin. Dinner? What kind of man invites strangers to dinner just because he likes a painting? He's not some creep, Dad, Olivia said, frustration creeping into her voice. He's a collector. He said he sees potential in me, and he wants to sponsor me. Richard's frown deepened. What do you mean, sponsor? School, Olivia said, her voice soft but hopeful. Art school. Somewhere good. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Olivia could see the gears turning in his mind, the way he weighed every possibility, every danger. He had spent months trying to keep the family afloat, and she knew that he hated the idea of relying on a stranger. But she also saw something else in his eyes, a flicker of helplessness, a silent acknowledgement that they were running out of options. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly. All right, he said, though the words seemed to cost him. We'll go to this dinner. But I want to know exactly what kind of deal this man is offering. Olivia's heart soared with relief. Thank you, Dad. You'll see, he really wants to help. That evening, Olivia and Richard stepped out of their car in front of the restaurant. Olivia tugged nervously at the sleeves of her sweater. She wasn't used to places like this, fancy and polished, with golden lights spilling from the windows and waiters in crisp white shirts greeting guests at the entrance. Richard glanced around, visibly uncomfortable, adjusting the collar of his old worn-out jacket. This is a bit much, Richard muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. It's just dinner, Olivia whispered back, though she couldn't hide the nervous energy buzzing under her skin. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this meal was important. Inside, they found Michael Reynolds already seated at a table near the back. He rose from his chair as they approached, his smile warm and disarming. Olivia. Mr. Bennett, he greeted them, offering Richard a firm handshake. I'm so glad you both could make it. Richard returned the handshake cautiously, sizing Michael up with a glance. I figured we should meet face to face. Of course, Michael said smoothly, gesturing toward the table. Please sit. Order anything you like. Olivia and Richard sat down, and for a moment, the table fell into an awkward silence as menus were placed before them. Olivia stole glances at her father, watching the way his jaw tensed as he scanned the room, clearly out of his element. Michael, on the other hand, appeared entirely at ease. So, Richard said after a beat, folding his menu. You liked my daughter's painting enough to pay $5,000 for it. Michael smiled, folding his hands in front of him. Not just liked it. I recognized something special. Olivia has talent, real talent. And talent like that shouldn't be buried under bills and worries. He glanced at Olivia with a kindness that felt genuine. I want to help nurture that talent, give it a chance to grow. Richard narrowed his eyes. And what exactly do you mean by help? Michael didn't flinch under Richard's scrutiny. I want to sponsor Olivia's education, he explained, his voice calm and steady. There's a school in New York, a prestigious art academy. With the right training, Olivia could have a future as an artist. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression still guarded. And what's in it for you? Michael chuckled softly, as if he had expected the question. Nothing. I've been fortunate in life, Mr. Bennett. Someone once believed in me, and it changed my life. I see the same spark in Olivia, and I want to pay that kindness forward. Richard tapped his fingers on the edge of the table, still not fully convinced. It just sounds too good to be true. I understand, Michael said, his tone respectful. If I were in your shoes, I'd feel the same way. But I'm not here to take anything from you, I'm here to offer something. Before Richard could respond, Olivia spoke up, her voice quiet but determined. Dad, please. This is my chance. Richard glanced at his daughter, seeing the hope in her eyes, the spark of something he hadn't seen in months. He hated the idea of putting their trust in a stranger, but he also knew that the life they were living now wasn't sustainable. Finally, Richard gave a slow, reluctant nod. All right, he said, his voice heavy. But if anything about this feels off, we walk away. Got it? Absolutely, Michael agreed with a reassuring smile. I want what's best for Olivia. The waiter arrived just then, taking their orders. Olivia chose something simple, too nervous to eat much, and Richard ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, still uneasy about the whole situation. As the conversation continued, however, Olivia found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Michael spoke not just about her art, but about the possibilities that lay ahead, the kind of future she had only dared to dream about. He talked about galleries, exhibitions, and opportunities that could open doors she never knew existed. By the time the dinner ended, Olivia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A future that once seemed impossible now felt within reach. Richard remained cautious, but even he couldn't deny the change he saw in Olivia. For the first time since their world had been shattered, his daughter looked like she believed in something again. As they left the restaurant that night, Olivia knew that this dinner was just the beginning. Something inside her had shifted, something big. And though Richard still carried his doubts, Olivia felt certain that a new door had been opened. What they didn't know yet was that this new beginning would come with shadows of its own, shadows that had already started to move in the background, waiting to strike. As the Bennetts began to hope, tentatively, but for the first time in months, Victor Barnes stood in the background, watching them from a distance like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He wasn't the type of man to accept defeat, especially not from a charity-driven idealist like Michael Reynolds. The Bennett's house wasn't just another property to Victor, it was a critical piece of land that stood directly in the way of his next expansion. Losing out on it because of some last-minute generosity wasn't just frustrating, it was intolerable. Victor thrived on control, on bending circumstances to his will. And now, a stubborn family and an altruistic millionaire were testing his patience. He poured himself a glass of whiskey in his office, swirling the amber liquid as he stared at the blueprint of his latest project spread across the desk. The Bennett's house sat squarely in the middle of what was supposed to be a high-end condominium complex. If the family refused to move, the project would stall, costing him millions. That wasn't an option. Victor's lip curled as he set the glass down with a dull thud. "If they won't sell, I'll make sure they have no choice," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. He picked up his phone and made a call. "It's time to send a message," he said when the line connected. That night, long after the Bennetts had gone to bed, 3 figures crept toward their house. The men worked quickly, splashing red spray paint across the walls and shattering flower pots on the porch. One of them slashed through the tires of Richard's old truck, while another scratched deep gouges into the front door with the tip of a crowbar. They left behind one final touch: the words "leave or lose everything," scrawled in jagged letters across the side of the house. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the damage was done. Richard woke to the sharp pop of Lily's voice calling him from the front room. "Daddy! Daddy, come look!" He stumbled out of bed, still groggy, and made his way toward the door where Lily stood in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest. When he stepped outside, the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. The truck sat lopsided, 2 of its tires slashed beyond repair. The front door was scratched, the wood splintered from deep gashes. And then he saw the writing on the wall, the angry red letters glaring back at him. His heart sank. Lily's small hand tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, what happened?" Richard knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His own hands were trembling, but he forced himself to smile, trying to sound calm. "It's just a prank, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But Olivia had appeared behind them, her eyes wide and alert. She wasn't a little kid like Lily, she knew what this was. "This wasn't a prank," Olivia whispered, her voice tight. "This was a threat." Richard didn't argue. His jaw clenched, and he stared at the vandalism with quiet rage bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to scream, to punch something, but instead, he took a slow breath. There was no time for anger. "What do we do now, Dad?" Olivia asked, her voice low but steady. Richard straightened and placed a protective arm around both his daughters. "We keep going. No one's kicking us out of here." Lily burrowed closer to him, gripping his shirt as if afraid that, somehow, this could make their whole world collapse. Later that morning, after Richard cleaned up the worst of the mess outside, Olivia sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts swirling. The words painted on the wall echoed in her mind: "Leave or lose everything." She knew without a doubt who was behind it. Victor Barnes. She had seen the way his eyes had narrowed in the square, how furious he'd been when Michael had outbid him. That man didn't just walk away. He wasn't the kind of person to forget a slight. This was his warning. And if they ignored it, there was no telling what he might do next. That afternoon, Olivia slipped out of the house while her father was in the garage trying to fix the damage. She walked down the street, her mind made up. She needed to tell Michael. When she arrived at Michael's office, he greeted her warmly, but his expression shifted the moment he saw the tension in her face. "Olivia? What's wrong?" Olivia sat down across from him, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. "It's Victor Barnes," she said quietly. "I'm sure of it. Someone vandalized our house last night. They slashed the tires, broke things. And they left a message." Michael's face darkened. "What kind of message?" "They wrote leave or lose everything." Olivia's voice trembled slightly, but she fought to stay calm. "He wants us out, Michael. He's trying to scare us." Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His expression was serious now, the warmth in his eyes replaced by something colder, something sharp. "I suspected Victor might try something like this," he muttered. "He has a reputation for playing dirty when he doesn't get what he wants." Olivia stared at him, her heart pounding. "What do we do? My dad is trying to act like it's nothing, but I know he's scared." "I am too." Michael nodded slowly, his mind already working through the options. "I'm going to help you, Olivia," he said firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. If Barnes thinks he can intimidate you, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "We'll take this to the authorities, but we'll need more than just suspicion. We need proof." Olivia swallowed hard. "How do we get proof?" "He didn't leave anything behind, just the message." Michael's expression softened slightly. "Don't worry. I have some people who can help. We'll get what we need." He gave her a reassuring look. "You did the right thing by telling me. We're not going to let him get away with this." For the first time that day, Olivia felt a small flicker of hope. She had no idea what Michael planned to do, but something about the way he spoke made her believe that things might turn out okay. At least she wasn't facing this alone. Michael stood up and walked around the desk, placing a gentle hand on Olivia's shoulder. "Go home, Olivia. Stay with your family. I'll make some calls and take care of the rest." Olivia nodded, grateful but still nervous. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll get through this. I promise." While Olivia walked home, a sense of cautious relief settled over her. But the threat from Victor Barnes wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Michael Reynolds sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming softly against the polished wood as he waited for a phone call. Every move against Victor Barnes had to be precise. Victor wasn't just a greedy businessman, he was cunning and ruthless. Getting him behind bars would require more than accusations, it would require undeniable proof. Finally, the phone rang, and Michael picked up, his tone sharp and professional. "Talk to me." A voice on the other end, one of his trusted contacts, spoke quickly. "You were right about Barnes. The man's been in dirty deals for years. Property fraud, forced evictions, bribing officials. All buried deep, but I managed to dig some of it up. There's a pattern, Reynolds. Barnes has been clearing out low-income families to expand his developments." Michael leaned forward, tension tightening across his shoulders. "And the Bennett's house? Fits the same playbook. He's done this before: threats, intimidation, property damage. When people don't sell, things escalate." Michael pressed a hand to his forehead, already thinking several steps ahead. "What do we have in terms of hard evidence?" "Not enough yet. But if you give me time, I can get you financial records, bank transfers linked to his persuasions, conversations between his men, and some witnesses he thought had disappeared quietly." Michael nodded, even though his jaw clenched at the lack of immediate results. Time wasn't on their side. "Keep digging. I'll do my part on this end." After hanging up, Michael exhaled slowly. "We'll need more than just documents. If we're going to take Victor down, the world needs to see what he's done, clearly and unmistakably." Back at the Bennett's home, Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, a half-finished painting spread out before her. She had been working obsessively, pouring every bit of fear, anger, and hope into her canvases. Her paintbrush moved quickly, layering streaks of dark blues and reds across the surface. Each stroke felt like a release, a way to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. There was a sharp knock on her door. "Olivia." Richard's voice called softly from the other side. "Come in," Olivia answered without looking up from her work. Her father stepped inside, his gaze falling on the new painting. It showed a house, their house, surrounded by darkness, with angry red words slashed across the walls, just like the ones they had woken up to. But above the house, Olivia had painted a streak of light, breaking through the dark. It wasn't finished, but the message was clear: hope, even in the face of fear. Richard swallowed hard, the emotions catching in his throat. "You've been busy," he said quietly, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "Yeah," Olivia murmured, dipping her brush into a pot of white paint. "It's the only way I know how to handle all of this." Richard nodded, though a heavy sadness lingered in his eyes. "It's good, Liv. It's really good." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid between them. Richard hated how powerless he felt, how no matter how hard he tried to protect his daughters, danger seemed to creep closer. A few days later, Michael visited the house. Olivia led him into the living room, where several of her new paintings were stacked against the walls. Some were dark, filled with jagged lines and heavy shadows, capturing the fear they'd felt since the threats began. Others were softer, filled with moments of hope, like the one of her and Lily sitting together on the porch, clinging to each other as they stared into the uncertain future. Michael studied each canvas carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he turned to Olivia, there was a spark of something in his eyes, something more than admiration. "These aren't just paintings," Michael said slowly. "They're a story. Your story." Olivia gave a small shrug, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "It's just how I've been dealing with everything." Michael shook his head. "No, it's more than that. These paintings are truth. They show what's happening to you, to your family. People don't always believe words, Olivia. But art." He tapped the edge of one of her paintings. "Art makes people feel the truth." Olivia tilted her head, unsure of where he was going with this. "What are you saying?" Michael's eyes locked onto hers. "I think these paintings can do something no amount of paperwork or legal evidence ever could. They can show the world exactly what Barnes has done. They can expose the fear, the threats, the damage, everything. If people see it, they'll care. And once they care, Barnes won't be able to hide." Olivia felt a flicker of something deep in her chest, something close to hope. "You really think that'll work?" Michael gave her a small, knowing smile. "I think your paintings might just be the most powerful weapon we have." That evening, Olivia sat in her room, staring at the unfinished canvas in front of her. She thought about what Michael had said, that her art could be a way to fight back, to tell the world what was happening to her family. With renewed purpose, Olivia picked up her brush. She wasn't just painting anymore, she was documenting every moment, every threat, every emotion. She painted the vandalism on their house, the fear in her father's eyes, the weight of the past few months pressing down on her. And in every piece, she wove in a glimmer of hope, refusing to let darkness be the final word. A week later, Michael returned, this time with a plan. He laid out the details on the dining table, showing Richard and Olivia how they would combine the paintings with the legal evidence his contacts were gathering. "We're going to hold an exhibit," Michael explained. "Not just for art, but for justice. We'll display Olivia's paintings, tell her story, and connect it with the proof of Barnes's crimes. We'll invite the press, lawyers, activists, everyone who can make noise and demand accountability." Richard looked skeptical. "You really think people will care about a bunch of paintings?" "They will," Michael assured him. "Once they see what Olivia has captured, they'll care. And when they care, they'll put pressure on the authorities to act. Barnes won't be able to intimidate anyone anymore." Richard rubbed his hands over his face, the exhaustion etched deep into his features. "I just want my family to be safe. And they will be," Michael promised. "But we need to be smart about this. We need to make sure Barnes knows he can't win." Olivia sat silently, listening to the conversation unfold. For the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a way forward, like they had a chance. She glanced at the paintings leaning against the walls, each one holding a piece of their struggle. Michael was right. These weren't just paintings. They were a record of everything they'd been through. And now, they were going to show the world. With the plan in motion, Olivia felt a new sense of purpose settle over her. But as the date of the exhibit approached, there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a sense that Victor Barnes wasn't finished with them yet. The gallery buzzed with energy. Olivia stood near the entrance, her heart pounding as people flowed through the space, weaving between canvases that told her family's story. Michael had worked tirelessly to organize the exhibit, and it was finally happening. Journalists with cameras slung over their shoulders, art critics scribbling in notepads, and curious visitors moved from painting to painting, absorbing the journey Olivia had captured with every stroke of her brush. This was more than an art show. It was a statement, an exposure of everything Victor Barnes had done in the shadows. And the story wasn't just in Olivia's paintings, it was everywhere. Flyers printed with excerpts of Barnes's shady deals were pinned on the walls between canvases. Screens at the far end of the room played video interviews with people Barnes had forced from their homes, victims now brave enough to speak up. Michael stood by Olivia's side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Look around," he said quietly. "This is what happens when people finally see the truth." Olivia nodded, though her chest still felt tight with anxiety. It was surreal, seeing her life, her fears, her hopes, laid bare for strangers to witness. At one of the paintings, a woman wearing a sleek black coat leaned in to inspect the strokes. A reporter approached her, a microphone in hand. "This piece feels personal," the reporter said. "What's the story behind it?" Olivia overheard and stepped closer. "That's our house," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "After it was vandalized by Barnes's men." She gestured toward the red slashes she'd painted across the walls in the image. "They wanted us to feel scared. They wanted us to leave." The reporter furrowed her brow. "And instead, you decided to fight back." Olivia gave a small nod. "Through this. Through art." The reporter smiled, clearly impressed. "It's powerful work. People will talk about this." As the evening progressed, more people arrived. Olivia watched as pairs and groups stood in silence before her paintings, some with somber expressions, others whispering to each other in hushed tones. Richard, standing awkwardly near the back, glanced around with a mixture of discomfort and pride. He had never imagined they would be here, his daughter's art hanging in a gallery, her voice reaching so many. But the pride he felt was laced with a lingering sense of unease. He knew men like Barnes. They didn't go down without a fight. Meanwhile, Lily wandered through the exhibit, her small hand gripping Richard's tightly as she stared at the paintings. "That's us," she whispered, pointing at one canvas. It showed the three of them huddled on the porch, with darkness pressing in around them. Richard knelt beside her. "Yeah, that's us," he murmured. "But see that light?" He pointed at the streak of yellow Olivia had painted breaking through the dark sky. "That's what your sister wants people to see." Lily tilted her head. "The hope." Richard smiled, ruffling her hair. "Exactly." Near the center of the room, Michael greeted two men in suits. Olivia recognized them as detectives, the same ones Michael had contacted when he began building the case against Barnes. "Everything's coming together," one of them said to Michael, glancing meaningfully at Olivia's paintings. "We've got witnesses. And the financial records you provided. Well, let's just say Barnes is running out of places to hide." Michael gave a curt nod. "Good. Let's make sure there are no loose ends." The detectives exchanged glances and left, their expressions grim but determined. Olivia wandered to the back of the gallery, needing a moment away from the crowd. She felt overwhelmed, not just by the attention, but by the significance of what was happening. It was hard to believe that the nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Michael found her standing alone and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing great, Olivia," he said softly. "This exhibit. It's already making waves. People are listening." Olivia looked up at him, her green eyes clouded with a mix of relief and lingering doubt. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. "What if Barnes finds a way out?" Michael's expression hardened. "He won't. We've got him." The next day, news about the exhibit exploded across local media. Articles ran with titles like "The Art That Exposed a Tycoon's Crimes" and "How a Young Artist Brought Justice to Light." Barnes's name was everywhere, tied not to success or wealth, but to corruption and criminality. The pressure on law enforcement mounted until they had no choice but to act. Barnes must have sensed it coming. 2 days after the exhibit opened, Michael received word that Barnes had cleared out his office, wiped his personal accounts, and was preparing to leave town. "He's trying to run," Michael told Olivia over the phone. "But the police are already moving. They won't let him get far." Olivia gripped the phone tighter, her pulse racing. "What happens if they don't catch him?" "They will," Michael assured her. "And even if he gets away, he'll have nowhere to hide. Everyone knows who he is now." Just as Michael predicted, Barnes's escape was short-lived. He was caught trying to board a private jet out of state, arrested on multiple charges ranging from property fraud to witness intimidation. When the news reached Olivia, she felt the weight lift off her chest for the first time in months. For so long, Barnes had been a shadow over their lives, always watching, always threatening. Now, finally, that shadow had been dragged into the light. The courtroom was packed on the day of Barnes's trial. Olivia sat between Michael and her father, her hands clenched in her lap as witness after witness took the stand. Former tenants, former business partners. One by one, they told their stories, painting a damning picture of Barnes's long history of corruption and greed. Olivia's paintings were submitted as evidence, displayed on screens for the jury to see. They weren't just art, they were testimony, proof of the fear Barnes had inflicted on those he couldn't control. Barnes sat at the defense table, his face stone-like as the evidence against him piled higher. Olivia watched him closely, trying to see if there was any hint of regret or remorse in his eyes. But there was none, only cold, simmering rage. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the room erupted in whispers. Olivia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Barnes was escorted from the courtroom, his hands cuffed in front of him. As he passed by Olivia, he locked eyes with her. His expression was filled with hatred, his lips curling into a sneer. "This isn't over, girl," he hissed under his breath, his voice dripping with venom. Olivia held his gaze, her heart steady. "You can't hurt us anymore," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. Barnes's sneer deepened, but there was nothing he could do. The guards pulled him forward, leading him out of the courtroom and into the cold reality of his new life, a life behind bars. As the door to the courtroom closed behind Barnes, Olivia felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and triumph settle over her. The fight was over, but the journey wasn't. She knew there was still more to do, more healing, more rebuilding. But for the first time in a long time, she believed that their future was finally within reach. And this time, it was a future they would shape on their own terms. The days after Victor Barnes's conviction felt strangely quiet, like the calm after a storm. The tension that had clung to the Bennett household for so long slowly began to lift. Richard no longer woke up dreading what might come in the mail or fearing another attack in the night. For the first time in months, he could sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and not feel crushed under the weight of unpaid bills and unanswered questions. Lily seemed lighter too, her giggles returning as she played on the front porch, no longer looking over her shoulder for shadows. And Olivia finally allowed herself to breathe. But even as peace settled back into their lives, change was already stirring. Olivia had been accepted into the New York School of the Arts, one of the most prestigious art academies in the country. The acceptance letter had arrived the day after the trial, as if the universe were rewarding her resilience. Richard stood in the doorway of the kitchen, holding the letter in both hands, reading it for the third time as Olivia watched anxiously. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Olivia smiled, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're really okay with me going to New York?" Richard set the letter down and crossed the room, pulling her into a tight hug. "Liv, you fought for this every step of the way." "Of course, I'm okay with it." He paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's time for you to do what you're meant to do." The morning Olivia left for New York was bittersweet. Lily clung to her like a lifeline, refusing to let go. "Do you have to go?" Lily whimpered, her arms wrapped tightly around Olivia's waist. Olivia knelt down to her sister's level, her hands resting gently on Lily's shoulders. "I do, Lil," she whispered. "But I'll come home, I promise. And you'll see, you're going to be so proud of me." Richard stood nearby, doing his best to hide the emotions that welled up inside him. "She'll be fine," he said softly to Lily. "And so will we." Olivia hugged both of them one last time, and then with her bags packed and her heart full of hope, she climbed into the car that would take her to the airport. As they drove away, she glanced back at the small house, her house. It wasn't just a place anymore, it was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had refused to let go of. New York was overwhelming at first, the noise, the crowds, the relentless pace of the city. But Olivia threw herself into her studies with the same determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of the past year. Every class, every critique, every late night spent in front of a canvas felt like a step toward something bigger, something she had always dreamed of but never truly believed was possible. Michael stayed in touch from the very beginning, checking in regularly to make sure she was adjusting. He had become more than a mentor, he was a constant presence in her life, always there with advice, encouragement, and quiet wisdom. One evening, a few months into her first semester, Olivia received a package at her dorm. Inside was a small sketchbook, the pages filled with empty frames, each one waiting to be filled. A note was tucked inside. For the stories only you can tell. Michael. Olivia smiled as she ran her fingers over the blank pages, feeling the weight of possibility settle over her. She grabbed a pencil and began sketching, the lines flowing easily, as if the pages were welcoming her stories. As the months passed, Olivia's work began to attract attention. Professors praised her ability to infuse raw emotion into every piece she created, and her classmates admired the honesty and vulnerability in her art. One of her pieces, a large haunting canvas depicting her family's struggle against Barnes, was selected for an exclusive student exhibition in the city. The painting showed a house surrounded by shadows, with streaks of light cutting through the darkness, symbolizing their journey from fear to hope. On the night of the exhibit, Olivia stood silently in front of her painting as people gathered around it. She listened to their murmurs, their quiet discussions about the emotions the piece evoked. "It feels so real," someone whispered. "It is real," Olivia thought, though she didn't say it aloud. After the exhibition ended, Olivia stepped out into the cool night air, feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. She hadn't expected her story to resonate with so many people, but it had, and that realization filled her with a quiet, steady pride. As she walked down the sidewalk, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She smiled when she saw Michael's name on the screen. "Hey," she said, pressing the phone to her ear. "How'd it go?" Michael asked, his voice warm and familiar. "It was incredible," Olivia admitted. "I still can't believe people actually connected with my work." Michael chuckled softly. "I told you they would. You have a gift, Olivia. And now the world is starting to see it too." There was a brief silence between them, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind shared by people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. "Thank you," Olivia whispered. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." "You did this, Olivia," Michael said firmly. "I just gave you a little push." Back in Boston, Richard and Lily followed Olivia's progress from afar. Richard kept every article, every review, every mention of her work, clipping them carefully and storing them in a folder on the kitchen table. One evening, as he flipped through the collection of articles, he smiled to himself. Olivia was building a life, her life, and he couldn't have been prouder. "She's doing it, Lil," Richard whispered to his youngest daughter, who sat curled up beside him on the couch. Lily nodded, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I knew she would." Months turned into a year, and Olivia's reputation continued to grow. She was invited to participate in more exhibits, and her paintings began to sell for prices she never could have imagined. But no matter how far she went, she always stayed connected to her roots. On one of her trips back home, she stood in front of the house where it had all begun, the place where she had fought, painted, and dreamed her way toward a future she could finally call her own. Michael joined her on the porch that day, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "You've come a long way," he said softly, looking at her with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Olivia replied. Michael shook his head. "Yes, you could have. You just didn't know it yet." Olivia smiled, glancing toward the horizon. "Maybe someday, I'll help someone else the way you helped me." Michael nodded. "I have no doubt you will." Olivia's journey was far from over, but she knew now that she was exactly where she was meant to be, standing at the edge of a future she had fought for, with the people who believed in her still by her side. And this time, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Years later, Olivia stood under the shade of a large oak tree in Central Park, watching as people strolled by, couples with intertwined hands, children chasing pigeons, musicians performing for loose change. Life moved effortlessly around her, but Olivia felt rooted in the moment. This meeting had been a long time coming, and though much had changed in her life, there were certain connections that remained constant. A familiar figure approached from the distance, Michael Reynolds, the man who had set her life on an entirely new path. His hair had grown a little grayer over the years, his movements slightly slower, but his presence carried the same warmth it always had. "Michael," Olivia greeted him with a smile that reached her eyes. Michael returned the smile, his expression one of quiet pride. "Olivia," he said, "it's good to see you." They found a nearby bench, and as they sat side by side, the conversation flowed easily, like the many they had shared over the years. Olivia had changed too. She was no longer the unsure, hopeful girl who had tried to sell a painting in the town square. Now she was a recognized name in the art world, her works displayed in galleries across the globe, her story an inspiration to others. She had everything she once thought impossible: a thriving career, stability for her family, and a sense of purpose that ran deeper than success. But despite all that she had accomplished, Olivia knew there was one thing left to say, something that had been on her mind for years. She turned to Michael, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for what you did for us." Michael chuckled gently, shaking his head. "You've thanked me enough times already, Olivia." "No," Olivia said, her gaze steady. "I mean it. If it weren't for you, for everything you gave me, I don't know where we'd be." Michael leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his knees. His eyes held a mixture of affection and humility. "You earned everything, Olivia. I just gave you a little push in the right direction." Olivia smiled, though she felt the weight of a question she had carried for years finally rising to the surface. "Why did you do it?" she asked, tilting her head. "Why me? Why help us the way you did?" Michael's expression softened, and he let out a slow breath, as if he'd been waiting for this moment as well. "Because," he began, his voice low and reflective, "a long time ago, someone did the same for me." Olivia's brow furrowed. "Really?" Michael gave a small nod, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "I wasn't much older than you were back then. I didn't have much, no direction, no one to believe in me. But there was a teacher. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Michael smiled faintly. "He gave me a chance, opened doors I never even knew existed. And it changed everything." He paused, meeting Olivia's gaze. "When I saw you standing in that square, holding that painting, I saw the same thing in you that he once saw in me. It was like I knew I had to do for you what he did for me." Olivia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a deep sense of gratitude that words couldn't fully express. "So this was your way of paying it forward," she said quietly. Michael nodded. "Something like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world move around them. Olivia knew that everything she had built, her art, her success, the stability she had given her family, was only possible because of the kindness and belief of a man who could have easily walked away. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I promise I'll do the same one day, Michael." Michael smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "I know you will, Olivia." The weight of those words settled between them, not as a burden, but as a quiet understanding. They both knew that life had a way of coming full circle, that the greatest gift was not success, but the ability to lift others the way they had been lifted. A few weeks later, Olivia stood in her studio, surrounded by canvases waiting to be brought to life. Her career was flourishing, but she knew that the most important part of her journey was still ahead of her, the part where she would reach out her hand to someone else, just as Michael had reached out to her. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and Olivia glanced at the screen. It was an email from a young artist she had met at one of her exhibitions, a girl whose paintings were raw with emotion, just as Olivia's had been years ago. The girl was struggling, unsure if her art had any value, if her dream was even worth pursuing. Olivia smiled softly as she typed her reply. "Your art is beautiful. Keep going. If you need help, I'm here." As she hit send, Olivia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, living proof that kindness could change the world, one small gesture at a time. And as she picked up her brush and began to paint again, Olivia knew that the story wasn't over. It never really ended, it just continued, one act of kindness leading to another, in an unbroken circle of hope and possibility.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.